everyone, and welcome back to Culture and the Environment. In this unit, we're going to talk about the everyday life of biodiversity conservation. So we're going to connect the topics of our two previous units on the notion of nature as wilderness and on the political ecology of environmental conservation. For this unit, you're reading a selection of chapters from an ethnographic monograph by anthropologist Celia Lau. The book, entitled Wild Profusion: Biodiversity Conservation in an Indonesian Archipelago, was published in 2006, and it is based on anthropological field research in the Indonesian Tongian Islands in the late 1990s. The book is an ethnographic account of Indonesian conservation biologists and Sama people in these Tongian Islands, which are just off the coast of Indonesia's central Sulawesi province. The book is at the same time an analysis of biodiversity in practice through the work of field conservation scientists and an analysis of Sama people's own nature-making practices and idea. The Sama people are one of the indigenous people of the Tongian Islands. As Lau writes on page 2 of the book, natures are made at the intersections of humans with their particular social histories and plants and animals with their unique evolutionary and ecological histories. Neither science nor society will tell us all the interesting things one might want to know about these natures. Now, I would like you to stop for a second and consider this sentence. What might it mean? Write down your thoughts. So, the Tongian archipelago faces the Gulf of Taumini in Indonesia's Sulawesi province. It has a volcano and 6 islands. The Tongian settlements on the shorelines are typically built in wood, cement, as well as forest materials, and they're surrounded by coconut forests and gardens. In the forest, Tongian people harvest timber, sago, and medicinal plants. And in the sea, they fish and gather sea cucumbers, some for their subsistence and others to sell on the national and international markets. And I'm going to talk about this in a little while. There are resource extractions activities as well. For example, an Australian-Indonesian pearl farming venture and a Japanese-Indonesian logging operation. These were going on at the time of Celia Lau's research, which I just wanted to remember was about 20 years ago. And travelers from Europe, of course, flocked to the island's many tourist resorts, typically located on the coasts. In the 1990s, during Celia Lau's research, around 30,000 Tongian people from almost 30 distinct ethnic groups lived in the islands. Many had settled in the archipelago coming from the surrounding mainland. Most residents at the time were Muslims, and their villages often received development subsidies from the Indonesian government. Lau lived with the community of Sama people and also shadowed the conservation scientists who were working at the local research center on the islands. The scientists that Lau worked with were attempting to document the island's biodiversity, as well as to provide development to the Tongian people and to turn the archipelago into a national park. Lau frames her work as an anthropological account of Tongian nature, including both environmental change, everyday practices, political economies, as well as shifting perspectives on what nature is and how it is made. In part then, this is an attempt to document the making of biodiversity through ethnographic practice. And Lau takes biodiversity as a way of looking at the world, as well as a set of scientific practices and also kinds of regimes of environmental governance. The term biodiversity emerged in the mid-1980s in the United States, and it quickly reconfigured earlier notions of environmental risk, resource preservation, environmental value, and wilderness. But biodiversity started off as a Euro-American concern. However, the sites that held the most biodiversity in the world were located in colonial and post-colonial settings in the so-called Global South. While initially Euro-American elites and scientists had dominated conservation policy, scientists and other experts located in the Global South took on leadership roles. The moment of the rise of biodiversity as a concern and as a way of looking at the environment and locating value within it also coincided with the proliferation of non-governmental organizations or NGOs and transnational activist networks. Lau was influenced by early political ecology approaches, which called for a recognition of the effects of conservation projects in which a Euro-American notion of nature had displaced other local experiences and values of environments, as well as the coercive practices through which conservation areas were created. So in the 1980s, scientists established that the Tujian Islands had potential for a nature conservation area, particularly after consulting 19th century work of natural historians from Europe who had worked on documenting particularly bird and coral varieties in the area. The work of a prominent Indonesian biologist had led to the founding of a Tujian research station. Celia Lau draws from a post-colonial approach to understand the relative positionality of Indonesian scientists, who were in turn marginalized in the international scientific networks. So, for example, the Indonesian scientists that she talked to were expected to know the Euro-American literature, but the opposite was not true. Many foreign scientists coming to work on the islands talked about the Indonesian natural scientists as if they were less than real scientists, and almost as if they were just expected to contribute data, but not really to make big theoretical intervention in their field. This expectation that Indonesian conservation scientists would conform to international standards but not intervene in debates constituted the conservation scientists in the Tujian Islands as at once occupying an elite position at the national scale, and particularly vis-a-vis the Tujian Island residents, at the same time as a marginal one in their international scientific circles, where they were in conversation with colleagues. So Celia Lau lived for about a year in a Sama village of around 2,000 residents. And she also followed the Indonesian scientists who work at the local research center headquarters for another year of her research. The Sama village was surrounded by mangrove trees, where Sama maintained navigation channels. They also cultivated vegetable gardens, tended to fruit trees, grew yam, coconut, cloves, and sago. In the forest, they encouraged the growth of rattan and bamboo, which they used to build boats and also houses. The Sama people occupy a relatively large area. They are found along coasts through Southeast Asia. In the Tujian Islands, as well as elsewhere, the Sama undertake long fishing voyages called pangkat, where they collect fish and marine cucumbers. They do, in fact, return to their villages, and some Sama prefer not to fish at all, and instead they prefer to tend to their village gardens. The Sama people are typically known for living on their boats during the sea cucumber and fish harvest, which can be quite long. Often, they have been described as exotic navigators and as landless people without any connection to land or to a fixed place of residence, and they have been denigrated for that. In the Tujian Islands, conservation scientists often deemed the Sama responsible for marine environmental degradation as well as for backward agricultural practices. So, for example, government officials considered sago, which is a crop, an inferior type of food, a poor people's food, and encouraged Sama to eat rice instead, rice that they would acquire either at the local stores or as development subsidies. And similarly, the biodiversity scientists ignored the very diverse ecosystem that was flourishing at the edge of the sago swamps, which Sama people cultivated, and the cultural and economic value that sago landscapes held for them. So in chapter 3 of the book, which you have read or will read, Lau describes a pongkat, a fishing and sea cucumber harvesting expedition in which she participated. Sama fishers harvest the sea cucumbers at night, and then during the day they smoke them to prepare them for the market. But the pongkat is also a time where people exchange stories, particularly stories of adventures, and stories of pongkat are really well-liked genres of narrative. Some of Lau's Sama interlocutors explained to her that their mobility was in fact essential to protect the village's sea cucumbers resources. They explained that fishers travel where they know that the catch is going to be abundant. So the pongkat voyages, as well as the cultivation practices such as the sago swamp cultivation, inscribed a sense of place on the Sama's bodies. They acquired an embodied and tacit knowledge of the sea cucumbers, of sago swamps and plants, of other crops and plants and animals. And at the same time, their practices of fishing and cultivation remade the local land and seascapes. However, local conservation scientists were wary of these nomadic practices, and they claimed that because of their mobility, Sama could not care about their environments, since they were always on the move. Some of the attempts to manage the island's terrestrial or marine ecosystems involved tracing village boundaries and areas of exclusive use in the sea, and also assigning the ability to collect taxes from outsiders' fishing rights. Other areas were completely closed off to fishing and to sea cucumber harvesting. Of course, the tourist resorts and the pearl harvesting areas were also closed to Fijian people's access. As a result, this fragmentation of fishing areas generated new competitive practices between different ethnic groups that previously had negotiated access in the more mobile and expanse fishing territories. Some Fijian groups learned that they could easily blame Sama people for unsustainable practices like cyanide fishing and weed bombing, as the local conservation biologists were ready to believe them. So even though American and Japanese soldiers had first introduced blast fishing during World War II, this practice had become associated to the Sama people. Many observers thought that the Sama were in fact agents of environmental destruction, to which in fact Lau argues they were the victims. Conservationists also associated cyanide fishing practices with the Sama people, despite the fact that groups of Fijian residents of different ethnicities, in fact, use cyanide. This was used to catch live fish to export to Hong Kong and Singapore. An NGO that attempted to make a development intervention understood this fishing practice as a matter of culture and as a problem of a tradition that had been lost, and developed local projects that aimed to reintroduce the traditional line fishing techniques to encourage fishermen to go back to these more sustainable techniques. However, most fishermen already used line fishing, and in other words, the Sama were at the same time seen as valuable providers of fish for fish traders and for international markets, and at the same time they were cast as responsible for biodiversity loss from the perspective of the local conservation scientists. So this was a puzzle that Lau had to unpack, and she used a political ecology approach. She asked questions about the wider processes that determined who would fish with cyanide and why, and who would come to profit from it, and who would take the blame and suffer the consequences of this practice. So the trade had started in Hong Kong in the 1960s and then had expanded to the Philippines, to Papua New Guinea, to the Maldives and Indonesia. Sodium cyanide, which was released in the sea that had the effect of stunning the fish, which then could be captured live, also caused a high mortality in the fish, bleached the coral reefs, and the fishers also had to break the reefs to catch the stunned fish, causing further damage to the coral. In the 1990s, live fishing brought cycles of bust and boom, bringing new cash to Sama people. There were fish traders who operated fishing camps where they bought several species of fish and kept them in water containers for months at a time, eventually accumulating enough that they could send them off on a large shipment to Hong Kong or to Singapore. Now, Sama fishers, of course, understood the effects of cyanide on fish in the open water, and they also knew how to revive the stunned fish to reduce mortality, and they understood the environmental effects. To understand who participated in cyanide fishing trade and practices, Lau says we really also need to look at class and ethnic dynamics locally. The fish trade businesses were often owned by wealthy Indonesians from Jakarta, and many of them from Chinese descent. They hired local bosses who typically came from Java and Kalimantan provinces, and the bosses who operated the camps purchased live fish from local Tujian people, including some Sama people looking to make some cash. This practice intersected with gender and age as well. Women fishers never used cyanide, and in fact, Lau found they were the most openly critical of the practice. And virtually all the cyanide fishers were young men. They were induced by the special appeal of what was an illegal practice, lured by the ability to earn more money to improve their local status. The village bureaucrats were also implicated in cyanide fishing economies, and only the villagers who were unable to pay them bribes ended up being prosecuted. There were other ways in which the live fishing trade had an effect, even with people who were not cyanide users. The fishing camps provided loans and boats to all fishermen, who therefore became tied to them through debt, which they repaid through their sale of fish. And these debt relations ensured a constant supply of fish for the national and international markets. From the start of her research, Celia Lau writes she was caught in a couple of quandaries. On the one hand, she started the project being committed to documenting the marginalization of Tujian people in the project of biodiversity conservation. And however, of course, she encountered a heterogeneity of perspectives and class positionings in the island. There was no homogeneous community. This is an island that was multi-ethnic and cosmopolitan, and not everyone was equally affected by the restrictions on land and water access. The second quandary was that the conservation scientists that she worked with believed that their work was fundamentally good, and they were motivated by an ethical belief that biodiversity and conservation and economic development would advance their country. In fact, under the Suharto regime in Indonesia, middle-class Indonesians were encouraged to undertake scientific studies. Science, like in many other places, had become a powerful symbolic marker of national development, class, and prestige, and it was discursively portrayed as an objective domain separate from political conversations. The preservation of nature, then, was closely tied to ideas about nationhood and scientific rationalism. Now, I would like you to pause for a second and think of another example in which the conservation of nature, and particularly scientific approaches to studying nature, is explicitly or implicitly tied to a project of ethno-nationalism. Just write down what comes to mind. Lau addressed this puzzle by, first of all, unpacking the large homogeneous categories of Sama and scientists, and instead she focused on what she called micro practices, by which she means the everyday things that people do. And she committed to equally observe conservation scientists in action with all of their contingencies and contradictions. The other aim of the book for Celia Lau was to write about Tujian nature in a way that was not essentialist, a way that recognizes the plurality, the proliferation of organisms, as well as meanings. And I would like you to assess the extent to which she was able to do that and some of the techniques of writing and ethnographic methods that work, that help to convey the sense of ecological relations at play in the everyday micro-practices of Sama people and conservation scientists. The research also coincided with the last few years of the Suharto presidency, which had been very long, and shortly after Lau had finished her long-term fieldwork, which constituted the basis for this book, social upheaval and a series of popular protests eventually led to the fall of the regime. So even though Lau was documenting scientific practices at work in what was an authoritarian context, she was attentive to some of the counter-hegemonic narratives and practices that nevertheless flourished. So, in a sense, she says both Sama people and the Indonesian biodiversity scientists on the Tujia Islands were reckoning with a series of problems and questions about nature, knowledge, and identity. And Lau's project is to see these questions as comparable, as part of the same kind of experience and puzzle, instead of understanding them as fundamentally distinct. This is all for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you soon.